Judge John Roberts sat at the top of the nation's most untouchable court, until Jasmine Crockett looked him in the eye and asked the one question. He couldn't answer. The room wasn't quiet. It was tense. Phones were already in hand, cameras were rolling. The buzz of anticipation wasn't casual. People knew this wasn't just another hearing. Something felt different. And then from the left side of the panel, Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone, steady but sharp. Chief Justice Roberts, she began, voice cool and clear. Let's stop pretending the public trusts this court the way it used to. He blinked, still adjusting his tie. She didn't wait for a response. Who've got sitting justices accepting luxury vacations, private jet rides, and exclusive access to billionaires' retreats without disclosure. That's not an appearance of impartiality. That's a breach of basic ethics. And sir, you're the one who said the court can police itself. Do you really believe that? Roberts shifted in his chair, lips parting to deliver what likely had been prepped by half a dozen legal aides. Congresswoman, the independence of the judiciary, she cut in, isn't what's on trial here, it's integrity. And independence doesn't mean immunity. That was the moment people started texting their friends, turn this on right now to some. Jasmine Crockett was just another new voice in Washington, but that morning in front of millions of viewers and dozens of high-ranking officials, she became something else, someone who refused to let polished language or titles shield accountability. A man in the second row, a retired public defender from Cincinnati, shook his head with a grin. He wasn't used to seeing someone challenge power like that on national television and win the first round within minutes. Crockett continued, stacking her pages, flipping calmly. You've said before that your court abides by a set of principles. Sure, are they written? Where can the public read them? Where's the enforcement? No answer, just a pause. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the pause of calculation. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. We hold teachers to a code, police, military, nurse, but not the people with lifetime power to overturn laws, strip away rights, and decide elections. Help me understand how that makes sense. In a corner of the hearing room, a young journalist from Sacramento lowered her notepad. Mouth parted. This is real, she thought. This isn't political theater. This feels personal. Back at home in a small living room outside Tulsa, an older woman named Bernice sat on her couch, remote in hand. She hadn't voted in 10 years, too tired of the noise. But something about that young congresswoman on the screen stirred her gut. Way she talked, the fire behind her eyes, it wasn't rehearsed. It was real. Roberts finally spoke. Congresswoman, the court has historically exercised discretion. And discretion, Crockett repeated, almost laughing. That's the word you wanted to go with. She opened her folder and slid out a glossy photo. This is you on a private yacht in Santorini. The trip wasn't disclosed. The guest list included donors with active cases before your court. Roberts looked down, and in that second, the camera caught it, his jaw tightening, his gaze darting. Let's not pretend, she said quietly. The people watching at home, they're not stupid. They can feel when something's broken, and you're sitting at the top of that broken system pretending it's running just fine. A few murmurs rose in the room. Samine, near the back, clapped once before being quickly hushed. What Jasmine Crockett had just done wasn't a political stunt. It was a direct hit, layered in facts, dressed with calm and delivered like truth had a deadline. She hadn't raised her voice on sesh, hadn't needed to, and somewhere across the country, people who hadn't cared about judiciary hearings before were suddenly tuning in and staying. But that was only the first shot. What came next would test everything: Roberts' composure, the committee's patience, and Crockett's resolve. To really understand how everything got to this boiling point, you have to go back about a year. It started with whispers, articles buried halfway down, political blogs, quiet mentions on podcasts, investigative threads that only gained traction if someone with a big enough platform reposted them, lavish trips, private jets, access to exclusive retreats in Jackson Hole, Aspen, Martha's Vineyard. These weren't minor gifts. These were six-figure getaways tied to powerful names in finance and lobbying, people with stakes in the outcomes of Supreme Court decisions. And the troubling part, none of it had to be reported. There was no law requiring Supreme Court justices to disclose such perks unless they chose to. Lower court judges, yes, cabinet members, of course. Even freshman senators had more rules around ethics than the most powerful legal minds in the country. That disconnect had been bothering people for a while, especially folks who lived paycheck to paycheck. People like Raymond Harper in Bakersfield, California, who lost his home after a ruling weakened protections For tenants in favor of property developers or Tina Bell in Biloxi, Mississippi, whose adult son was denied appeal rights in a case that later came under scrutiny due to the judge's ties to a corporate prison board told them it wasn't just abstract, it was their life. That's why the House Committee on Government Oversight finally convened a hearing on judicial ethics. The goal pressed Supreme Court leadership to explain publicly there were no enforceable standards and why the court operated on something that felt a lot like honor system Justice John Roberts, as Chief Justice, wasn't legally required to appear but after mounting media pressure and an op-ed from a bipartisan group of former clerks he agreed to show it was framed as a gesture of goodwill. But it wasn't lost on anyone that his team negotiated the time limit for questions, a list of committee members allowed to speak, and even the color of the backdrop behind him. By the time the hearing began, every news network was live. CNN, MSNBC, even C-SPAN saw a spike in viewers. It felt like a reality show with consequences inside the room. There was tension, polite but dense. Members greeted one another with practiced civil timophones blinking red, aides whispering time cues from the side. Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for weeks. Your staff in Dallas had compiled hundreds of pages of receipts, legal filings, press coverage, dinner databases, even travel manifests quietly leaked from former private jet brokers. She wasn't the most senior person in that room. She wasn't the most famous either, but what she had, unlike many of her colleagues, was clarity. She didn't just want to ask questions, she wanted to make the American public feel why this hearing mattered, and for the public watching from lunchrooms, in Phoenix, barbershops in Detroit, and classrooms in Des Moines, there was a strange sense of hope. Not optimism exactly, but a kind of cautious curiosity. Cooled someone really challenge the court and make it stick? As Roberts gave his opening statement, it was clear he was playing defense. In a velvet robe, he spoke of respect for the institution, decades of judicial restraint, and the proud history of the court's independence. What he didn't mention was any plan for reform. Crockett sat motionless as he spoke, eyes locked. She wasn't there for performance. She was waiting, calculating the moment she would break through the well-crafted script and push him off autopilot. Behind her, other representatives shuffled papers, took notes, whispered to aides. Some had already decided their lines for post-hearing sound bites. But Crockett wasn't interested in headliness, or was interested in answers. She glanced down at the folder in her lap. Tucked into the top corner was a photo of a woman named Clarice Miles, an Alabama teacher whose retirement was gutted after a court ruling allowed a hedge fund to acquire her pension firm. Clarice had written Crockett a letter, 4 pages handwritten. Tell them, it said, what happens when we play fair and they don't. That folder wasn't just research, it was a loaded weapon. And Jasmine Crockett knew how to use it. But Roberts wasn't the only one watching her closely. Other forces in that room had plans tuned. Not all of them wanted this truth to come out. Jasmine Crockett didn't ease into it. The moment her name was called, she adjusted her mic and looked straight at Roberts, not with anger, but with precision. Chief Justice, I'm going to ask you a few questions that I already know the answers to. That's not for your benefit, that's for the people watching who haven't heard the truth said out loud. Yet she paused, not for drama but to give the weight of her words a second to sink in. Did you or did you not attend a private donor retreat in Sun Valley last year, organized by an individual whose corporation had a case pending before the Supreme Court? Roberts didn't blink. Congresswoman, I have maintained professional relationships with members of various communities. Me attendance at legal forums. She cut him off. It wasn't a legal forum, it was a luxury retreat. No panels, no academic review, no continuing legal education. You were flown in on a private Gulfstream G650, spent 3 nights at a chalet that rents for $45,000 a week, and shared dinner with the plaintiff's lead counsel. That's not community outreach, sir. That's proximity to power. The room went quiet again. The kind of quiet that has no air in it. Jasmine wasn't finished. I'm holding a flight manifest from Biltmore Aviation. You, your spouse, and a guest were on that plane. The retreat wasn't disclosed in your annual report. That violates even the non-binding guidelines your court claims to follow. Roberts adjusted his glasses. His hand twitched at the water glass in front of him. With respect, Congresswoman, the judiciary is not subject to the same ethics code as the legislative or executive branches. I'm aware, Crockett replied calmly. That's why we're here. She turned the page now. Let's talk about the financial trust managed by your cousin Harold Dean according to public records. Your household transferred $1, $2 million into that trust 6 weeks before a case involving a banking regulation landed in your court. That same trust held direct stock in one of the banks affected. You didn't recuse yourself, Roberts finally looked up, his composure bending. Are you accusing me of judicial misconduct? Crockett didn't flinch. I'm asking if you believe it's appropriate for the Chief Justice of the United States to have financial interests that rise and fall based on cases he rules on. There at waistline people would be quoting by nightfall. He opened his mouth again, but Crockett leaned back. Her body language said everything. She didn't need a response. The damage was already done. In the back row, a law student visiting from Oregon Law School began typing furiously on her laptop, whispering to a classmate, she's not just going after scandal. She's showing systemic failure. And it was true. Jasmine wasn't out for a gotcha moment. She wasn't ranting. She was walking the public slowly, methodically through a house filled with smoke, showing them where the matches were kept. And Roberts, he'd underestimated her, thought she'd stumble over legal jargon, thought she'd grandstand for airtime. Instead, she brought case law, financial records, ethics, opinions, and a human voice that didn't sound like a lawyer. It sounded like someone who cared. Crockett flipped to another document. This is an email from a senior clerk expressing concern over non-disclosed interactions between your chambers and unknown lobbyist. The clerk wrote, and I quote, "This goes beyond what I'm comfortable justifying under the usual discretion." That clerk has since resigned. Why? Roberts opened his mouth. Crockett raised her hand gently. I'll withdraw the question. I know you won't answer. It gasps, not loud but definitely present. She turned to the committee chair. I have one more document to present. And as she held up the final sheet, an affidavit signed by a whistleblower from the Federal Judicial Center. The room shifted again. This time even the skeptical members on the panel leaned forward. Jasmine Crockett had just changed the stakes, but just as the momentum was building in her favor, Simeon across the aisle prepared to pull the emergency brake, something even Jasmine didn't see coming. Before Crockett could present the affidavit, a voice broke in. Madam Chair, point of order. It was Representative Lowell Granger from Oklahoma, gray-haired, 3 terms deep, known more for procedural interruptions than actual legislation. His voice had the kind of artificial calm that made people instinctively brace themselves. I'd like to request that the Congresswoman's line of questioning be reviewed for relevance. We are not conducting a criminal investigation. Herr Crockett didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the paper in her hand. The chair replied, measured but unimpressive. Point of order is not sustained. Representative Crockett may continue. Granger leaned back, visibly annoyed. A few seats down, someone scribbled something on a legal pad and passed it down the road. Jasmine clocked it, but didn't react. Lifted the affidavit again. This document was submitted to my office under penalty of perjury. The signer worked in an administrative capacity within the Judicial Center. Claims they were asked to delete meeting logs between Supreme Court justices and outside individuals following a press inquiry. No, it was Roberts' turn to shift uncomfortably. I'd like to submit this document into the official record. Jasmine continued, handing it to the clerk. It's important that the public sees this. Isn't about speculation, it's about records, about receipts. She turned back to the Chief Justice. So let me ask again, sir, if you claim your court is above reproach, why is it acting like it has something to hide? There was no answer, only silence and a forced swallow. Jasmine took a breath. She'd prepared for pushback. She didn't care about the eye rolls or the quiet smirks from across the aisle. This wasn't about partisan theater. This was about accountability. Placed another sheet on the table. This is a letter from Melanie Clark, a former military widow from St. Paul, Minnesota. She wrote me after her Supreme Court case was dismissed without explanation. She spent 6 years trying to get survivor benefits your husband earned in combat. The justices never gave her an opinion. They denied certiorari and walked away. Crockett held up the letter. She ended it with one question, just one. If the people in those black robes are untouchable, then who are they really working for? A hush rippled through the room, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Jasmine looked directly at Roberts. Sir, that's what people are asking across this country, not because they hate the courts, but because they feel abandoned by them. Roberts stared back, face composite, but the tremor was there in the blink in the way his hands found each other on the table. Respect this institution, Jasmine continued, but blind Respect without accountability is just permission for corruption. A rustle of applause started in the spectator section. Before being immediately shut down by Securitate, Capitol rules were clear. No reactions during testimony, but some moments were. Too human to suppress. Crocker moved to her final document of the set. A spreadsheet. This spreadsheet shows travel and hospitality records from donors, who later had business before the court. You've met with 12 of them either socially or through events, and in 7 cases decisions were handed down that directly favored their interests. That may not be a violation of law under the current rules, but sir, those rules were written by youth. It's not justice, that's a closed circle. Roberts cleared his throat. Respectful Lycangens, I believe the judiciary remains the most disciplined and objective branch of our government. Nodded once slowly and respectfully. Chief Justice, I think the public disagrees. Speck's discipline without transparency isn't objectivity, it's control. That sentence hit hard, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet and dead on. At that moment, millions watching at home felt something shift. Whether they had legal degrees or not didn't matter. What Jasmine said made sense, and more importantly, it felt familiar, because if Ryan knows what it's like to play by the rules while someone else gets to rewrite them. But even as the walls began to close in around Robert, someone else in the room decided it was time to muddy the waters, and it wouldn't take long before Crockett had more than just ethical breach. To defend herself against Representative Blaine Ferris from Idaho, who hadn't said a word all morning, finally cleared his throat and tapped his microphone. Madam Chair, he began. He moved to suspend Representative Crockett's questioning until we can verify the authenticity of the so-called affidavit. Jasmine slowly turned her head toward him. No one challenged the authenticity when my colleague read a corporate memo aloud last week, she said calmly. But now that the document implicates a Supreme Court chamber, we want a pause for verification. Freeze didn't respond, but his smirk said it all. The games had begun. The chair replied, quickly brushing the motion aside. We've accepted affidavits into the record under penalty of perjury in every prior hearing. The motion is rejected. Continue Representative Crockett. Jasmine turned back toward Roberts. For the detour, Chief Justice, let's continue this time. She didn't reach for paper. She leaned in just slightly, voice lower. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, it's final. No one can appeal it, no one can overrule it. And that power, used right, can save lives, but used recklessly, it breaks them. Roberts adjusted in his chair. With all due respect, hold on, she said, raising a hand. But gently, you want to talk to you, not just as a member of Congress, but as someone who practiced law. I sat across from mothers whose kids were incarcerated by judges who later got caught in bribery schemes. Have watched people lose homes, jobs, children, because a courtroom wasn't neutral. And every time, when they wanted to go higher, when they wanted justice from the top, guess who they looked to? She pointed lightly toward him. You that pause wasn't for effect, it was for breath. I think you believe you're doing the right thing, but right now we're not debating your intent. We're debating your accountability. Roberts didn't answer. His face was still, but something in his demeanor softened, if only for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. A staffer handed Jasmine a slip of peppermint. Questioning, her eyes scanned it quickly. She didn't show it to the room, didn't make a scene of it. Her fingers curled around the edge of the desk. It was a warning. Threats posted online. Security recommends caution. After hearing, she didn't say anything, didn't let it change her posture bit. That quiet moment of tension wasn't lost on everyone across the room. Rep. Ferris leaned toward his aide and whispered something. One of the cameras caught it, just barely. No audio, but lip readers would later say he used the words, "We need to shut her down." Still, Jasmine kept going. She turned the hearing back to ethics and transparency, this time focusing on inconsistency. Spent Justice's financial disclosures. Justice Collins disclosed for events from the same donor that Justice Wade didn't, and yet both attended. Why? Roberts opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes darted to his legal counsel seated behind him. Jasmine didn't wait. Here's the truth, Chief Justice. If it weren't for investigative reporter Swe, wouldn't know half of what we know. Your court didn't volunteer this. You were caught. That's different. That line hung heavy, not accusatory, but deeply personal. In a courtroom, silence after a statement like that could last seconds. Here it lasted longer. Everyone was waiting for Roberts to respond, maybe even hoping he would finally. He said, "The court will review its internal policies." Jasmine leaned forward one more time. It's been over 100 years certain you think it's time, and for the first time. That day Roberts didn't have anything to say in the back. One of the press photographers lowered his camera and exhaled. He'd been capturing hearings for 9 years. She'd never seen a Chief Justice look so small. But Crockett knew something else was brewing. No from Roberts, but from the way the committee was beginning to shift, faces stiffening, staffers passing notes, time limits inching closer. Someone was preparing to end the session early. But before they cowled, Crockett still had one card left to play, and it would change how the country viewed the highest court in the land. 15 minutes later, the tone of the hearing shifted. Committee Chair Edna Burke glanced at the clock, then at her staff. Whispers traveled quickly along the days. Someone handed her a small folder with a note: attitude pressure coming from Senate leadership. They want to recess early. Jasmine noticed the change immediately. Once attentive faces around her began checking phones, whispering between aides. The rhythm of the hearing slowed. Deliberately, the chair cleared her throat. We are nearing our scheduled recess, and given several scheduling conflicts, we may not be able to resume questions until next week. Crockett raised her hand, not aggressively but like someone who's tired of games. Madam Chair, I've got 5 minutes left. I'd like to finish. There was a pause long enough for the cameras to pick up the hesitation. Burke eventually nodded. You may proceed. Representative Crockett turned back to Roberts. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was the kind people stop to listen to. You know, Chief Justice, when the public loses faith in a courtroom, they don't just lose trust in judges, they lose trust in the whole idea of fairness. He looked at her eyes, a little dull now. The confidence that opened the hearing had drained away, and when people like Melanie Clark and Clarice Milesi, one standard for billionaires and another for them, they stop believing this country is meant for them at all. She reached into her folder one last time and pulled out a series of charts: campaigns, PAC donations, luxury travel, and case outcomes. The pattern was there, and she didn't need to explain it. Roberts saw it too. You can call it discretion, you can call it independence, she said, but people are calling it what it is: corruption. Or if that word's too strong for you, call it erosion. Either way, it's eating something sacred. Roberts finally responded, his voice low and reserved. It's difficult, Congresswoman, to govern an institution that wasn't designed to be influenced by politics and yet has become a political target. She nodded slightly, then hit the final nail. No one forced this court to accept favors. No one asked the justices to fly privately or stay silent about conflicts of interest. Those weren't political attacks, they were choices, and choices are fair. Gamut and silence. That moment broadcast live echoed across the country. But Crockett wasn't just being heard on the House floor. She was being heard everywhere. Twitter threads were explodinkable. News anchors replayed her exchange in real time. Students streamed it in cafeterias. Even a few conservative legal commentators, rare allies, admitted she'd struck a nerve. And not everyone was happy about it. By the time the hearing recessed, the pushback had begun online. Attacks, twisted headlines, accusations of grandstanding from political pundits who hadn't even watched the full session. Anonymous accounts began targeting Crockett with vague threats and manipulated video clips. One major publication called her aggressive for doing what male representatives had done for decades. She didn't respond, not right away. Her staff knew the playbooklet: the truth, breathe before you defend it. Still, she could feel it happening. The slow turn. People in power didn't like being cornered, and she had done just that. With facts, not fury. That evening, a popular talk show host opened with a clip of her holding the affidavit in the hearing room. "If you missed this moment today," he said, "you missed the sound of accountability knocking." And it wasn't just newsrooms talking. In a courthouse hallway in Tempe, Arizona, young legal clerk replayed the moment for her mother on speakerphone. In Charleston, South Carolina, retired postal worker called his son just to say, "Did you hear her? She wasn't scared." Meanwhile, Jasmine sat in her office staring at her inbox, flooded with both admiration and vitriol. Her chief of staff knocked gently. "Want me to filter the threats?" Crockett shook her head. "No, let me see what scares them." But while the nation was still processing what had happened, Roberts' team began working behind the scenes to craft a counter-narrative, one that could protect the institution and shift the target off his back. Next morning, something strange happened. A joint statement was released from the Office of Chief Justice Roberts. It wasn't labeled a press release. It wasn't posted on the Supreme Court's official site. Instead, it was leaked strategically to well-connected legal reporters. It framed Crocker's questioning as an unfortunate deviation from the cooperative spirit of democratic oversight, and suggested she had mischaracterized the events discussed. Nowhere in the statement was any specific error. Pointed out no facts were refuted, but that wasn't the point. It was a soft attack, a legal PR move back in Washington. Jasmine read the statement from her office and slid the print out across her desk without a word. Her communications director, Orkelin Reese, stood in the doorway. They're trying to bait you. They want a sound bite they can flip. Crockett nodded. So we don't give it to them. We give them something heavier. Later that afternoon, she requested 5 minutes on the House floor. And in those 5 minutes, she didn't rant, didn't yell, didn't call names. She told a story. Clarice Miles called me again this morning, Jasmine said, her voice calm. She's 72 now. Her hands shake when she signs her. Nimesh told me she watched the hearing with her daughter on her cracked tablet. She said it felt like someone finally spoke her pain out loud. The chamber was silent. She doesn't care about partisan fights. She's not watching to see who scores political points. Who wants to know why she followed every rule, paid every fee, attended every hearing, and still got left behind? Crockett placed her notes down. I didn't mischaracterize anything. I translated it for the people. This government too often speaks around. That clip didn't just go viral, it became the top story that night across several networks. Even in unlikely corners, people paid attention. In Boise, Idaho, a conservative podcast host, known for dismissing ethics complaints, said on air, "Look, you don't usually agree with her politics, but she didn't lie. If the Chief Justice didn't want to face these questions, shouldn't have accepted that seat." And for the first time in weeks, a new wave of questions hit the court. This time from the outside. Journalists filed FOIA requests. Civic groups started petitions. Former clerks whispered to reporters. Crockett had shifted the wind, but her next move came 2 days later. In a press conference outside the Capitol steps, standing under a gray sky, she introduced a new piece of legislation, the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act. It proposed a binding ethics code for Supreme Court justices, mandatory disclosures of gifts and outside relationships, and an independent review board to investigate conflicts of interest. The press leaned in. Do I expect this to pass overnight? No, she said, but I expect people to remember who stood in the way. And I expect the justices to start thinking twice before accepting another yacht invitation. She ended the press conference without taking questions. That night, Roberts called an emergency meeting with his fellow justices. No minutes were published, no transcript exists. But what's known is this internal discussions began about crafting a voluntary ethics charter, the kind of document that didn't exist before. Crockett stood up and demanded one. In the days that followed, 2 more whistleblowers stepped forward and confirmed that Roberts's chambers had received advanced notice of an amicus brief filed by a high-profile lobbying group. Another disclosed that a longtime legal assistant was quietly reassigned after voicing concerns about financial disclosure. As for Crockett, the moment wasn't about fame, it wasn't about headlines. It was about follow-through. She gathered her staff in the conference room that Friday, folders stacked high, updates blinking on their tables. Who didn't win anything, yet she said they're scared, not sorry. And scared men in power get reckless. Her team nodded. The tone was serious, but the energy was fierce. In a bar in Milwaukee, someone played the clip of her speech on the TV over the counter. In a high school civics class in Albuquerque, a teacher used it to explain how checks and balances work when someone actually has the courage to use them. But courage only matters if you can survive the fire end. Jasmine's fire was only beginning to catch wind. Next, the real battle would move beyond hearings and headlines. It would go public, messy, and deeply personal. It started with a phone call. At 6 a.m., "Congresswoman, you need to see this." Collins' voice was tight. "No good news ever comes that early." Jasmine pulled on her sweatshirt, slid into her slippers, and opened her laptop while the kettle boiled. There, it was trending across every platform. Chad Sheba Shao Shan. Crockett leaks. A smear campaign had launched overnight, complete with heavily edited footage from 10 years ago when she represented a controversial defendant as a public defender. The clips were cut without context. Headlines: brutal, Crockett defended sex offender, now wants to lecture Supreme Court. Sipped her tea and kept scrolling. It didn't stop there. An anonymous account claimed she had falsified a campaign finance report. In her first race, a local radio host hinted she had ties to radical groups, though he never said which. Onessa political blog posted a blurry photo of her entering a bar claiming she may have been intoxicated in public. None of it stuck, but it didn't have to be true. It just had to be loud. Her phone buzzed again. Colin. Texting this time. They're hitting you from all sides. Wanna respond? She typed back. Not it. Yet this wasn't new. Crockett had watched it happen to others, especially women, especially black women, who raise their voices too far too often, or just too wealthy. Call it the flood. Not one scandal, but a burst of nonsense meant to wear you down, distract you, make you spend your time putting out fires instead of building anything new. But she wasn't backing down. Instead, she called a staff meeting. The mood in the room was mixed, some furious, some rattled, all loyal. Callan opened with the facts. Nothing sticks. The finance claim is flat out false. The video is a chopped version of a 2014 Cassidy bar photo taken 2 months ago. No one's even sure where. Then we stay. Fuck you, Jasmine said. We keep moving. That afternoon she appeared on a national news program. Host, known for softball interviews, tried to ease into the discussion. Representative Crockett, a lot of heat coming your way lately. Any thoughts on the backlash? She smiled slightly. People don't throw stones at quiet walls. The host laughed. But Jasmine didn't. He did my job. I asked real questions, and if the answer to that is character attacks, then maybe we're closer to the truth than they want us to be. She ended the segment with a short line that would be quoted for days. Power doesn't panic unless it's threatened. Later that week, an unexpected ally stepped forward. Judge Lionel Dix, who served on the D.C. Circuit Court for over 2 decades. He published an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer defending Crockett's conduct and calling the Supreme Court's lack of transparency an institutional failure. She did what the rest of us have been whispering about for years, he wrote. It's only controversial because it's true. That broke the silence. Suddenly more voices emerged. A retired clerk confirmed informal gifting norms. A law professor admitted justices often forgot to disclose trips. Narrative was shifting again back to the facts, and the public was listening. A poll released that Friday showed 72% of Americans now supported implementing a binding ethics code for the Supreme Court. It wasn't just liberals, independents, and even a slice of conservatives had come around. In Nashville, a retired Navy officer posted a video saying, I may not agree with everything she stands for, but I'll be damned if she didn't speak up when it counted. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Jasmine sat in her office watching the map of media coverage expand across the country. Her legislative proposal had gained to new co-sponsorship, much in the grand scheme, but it meant something. The tide was turning. Still, she wasn't celebrating, not yet, because she knew better than to mistake noise for change. I want structure, Ash told her team that night. I want policy hearings. Don't fix anything if they don't lead to paper. And while the firestorm outside raged inside her office, the work got quieter. More precise bills were drafted. Allies were contacted. Statements were prepared, not for Twitter but for real legislative impact. But as Crockett moved to solidify reform on, more obstacle loomed. One that would push this fight out of the halls of Congress and straight into the public square. And this time it wouldn't be about documents or rules. It would be about her. The town hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, wasn't supposed to be anything big, just a modest gathering at a community center. Plastic folding chairs, a crackling mic, a few local reporters in the back row. Jasmine Crockett had agreed to attend as a show of gratitude for grassroots organizers who had been emailing, calling, and pushing support for the judicial transparency and accountability act introduced. But by the time she arrived, the parking lot was full. People stood outside in 90-degree heat, fanning themselves with printouts of the proposed bill. Inside, every seat was taken. An overflow crowd watched from a projector in the hallway. When Jasmine took the mic, it didn't feel like a campaign speech. It felt like something else. We've all been to hearings where nothing changes, she began. We've all heard promises wrapped in fancy words. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to ask you something, though. You want a justice system you can trust, or one that only trusts itself? The crowd erupted. Not staged applause, real emotional, frustrated cheers. She kept it short. 10 minutes. Then she opened the floor to questions. A woman in the front row stood, late 50s denim jacket, nurse's scrubs still peeking out underneath. My brother's doing 10 years in federal prison for a charge that wasn't even violent. This judge got a trip to Costa Rica the same year. Why can't people like you make that illegal? Jasmine didn't blink. That's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. But let me be real with you, laws don't pass because they're fair. They pass when enough people make it harder to ignore the unfair. A man At the back raised his hand if they're going after. You does that mean this might actually work? She gave a half smile. I sure hope so. But outside reporters had gathered for a different reason. Earlier that morning, the Chief Justice's office issued a public letter, not a leak this time, but a formal statement. It included phrases like inflammatory rhetoric, misuse of committee authority, and the kicker, undermining the delicate balance between branches of government. It didn't mention Jasmine by name, but it didn't have to. She read the letter on the plane ride home, folded it neatly, and passed it to Callan. They're trying to turn this into a turf war, she said. Callan didn't look up. They are panicking back in D.C. The pushback had hardened a senator, one she'd worked with on housing reform, suddenly pulled his name from her ethics bill. A donor group she'd met with last fall canceled a meeting to avoid controversy. Some colleagues stopped returning her calls. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind her that speaking truth to power has a cost. But for every door that quietly closed, another cracked open. In Flint, Michigan, a group of high school seniors sent her a video of their mock debate, arguing whether the Supreme Court should be bound to the same ethics as other government officials. One girl said, if she can say that to the Chief Justice, then I can speak up in class in Pittsburgh. A pastor invited her to speak not about politics but about courage, and on Capitol Hill, a quiet movement grew. A few lawmakers, tired of pretending this was normal, began pushing for hearings of their own, not just on ethics, but on judicial influence, owner access, and lifetime appointments. Still, the pressure was mounting. She received another security briefing. The online threats had intensified. Her home address had been posted, anonymous voicemails filled with hate. Most didn't bother her. She dealt with worse, but it was starting to wear on her staff. You sure this is worth it? Callan asked one night after a long day. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. If it wasn't worth it, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to stop it. That week, Roberts made a rare public appearance at a university in Missouri. During the Q&A, a student asked him directly, "Do you believe justices should be held to the same ethical standards as the rest of us?" He dodged the questions, mild, moved on, and people noticed the headlines the next day didn't praise his speech. They asked why he wouldn't answer. Crockett hadn't just introduced a bill, she had introduced a crack in the illusion that people could see. But with momentum finally turning her way, the fight wasn't over. Not until real change was passed, and not until she made one final statement that no one could ignore. 2 weeks later, Jasmine Crockett stood on the House floor once more. This time, there were no accusations, no folders stacked on her desk, no dramatic pauses, just one printed copy of the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act and a quiet resolve. The room was half full, as always when the cameras weren't rolling for prime time. But she didn't need a crowd. She needed the words to hit the record and to echo beyond it. She looked straight ahead and began, "This isn't a bill about punishment, it's a bill about standards, about finally saying that no one, not even the 9 people with the most unchecked power in this country, should be above the principles they claim to uphold." She paused, not for effect but for breath, real breath. When we talk about ethics in the judiciary, we're not talking about politics, we're talking about trust. We're talking about what happens when a single mother loses her home because a judge had a conflict of interest and nobody ever knew. We're talking about veterans who can't appeal decisions handed down by people who owe favors to private firms. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. For every person who thinks this fight is symbolic, I agree. It is symbolist. It's a symbol of what happens when one woman refuses to let silence win. People were listening, maybe not all of them in that room, but everywhere else. Back in Kansas City, a retired school teacher named Marjorie paused her gardening to watch the speech. Live in Sacramento, a group of law students huddled around a laptop. In Tallahassee, a middle school civics class stayed 5 minutes after the bell to finish watching. Jasmine continued, "This body has debated over dress codes, renaming post offices, and holiday resolutions. But we've never required the Supreme Court to follow a basic code of conduct. Not once in our nation's history." She picked up the bill and held it with both hands. "This paper won't change that overnight, but it'll start something that's overdue, something that won't stop when I leave this room. Because it's not about me, it's about who comes next, and what kind of country we're leaving them at that." She stepped away from the mic and sat down. There was no applause. There never is on the House floor. But outside, that was a different story. The clips spread again, not as fiery as the first, but deeper, more grounded, like the final verse of a song that had been building waiting for resolution, and the pressure worked within a month. The House Ethics Committee issued its first formal request for the Supreme Court to adopt a written code. Within 2 months, a revised version of Crockett's bill passed out of committee with bipartisan amendments, and a surprising Republican-sponsored Senate. Would be harder, slower, but something had shifted, and Roberts, he never responded publicly again. But insiders reported he privately began drafting a non-binding ethics framework for the court. It didn't go as far as Crockett's bill, but it was more than he ever intended to give. People debated whether Jasmine won, whether anything actually changed. But in a town where most speeches disappear the same day, there made hers stuck a poster quoting her Linipower doesn't panic unless it's threatened ended up on dorm walls. Her staff received hundreds of letters from small towns, military families, public defenders, even former clerks who never thought they'd see someone say what she said out loud on record without backing down. The real lesson: that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee a happy ending, but it does leave a mark. And in time, that mark becomes a path someone else can follow if you believe that. Accountability matters at every level for everyone. Don't scroll past, speak up, share the stay engaged. And remember, silence protects power, but your voice, it's how change begins.